Hi, this is Peter Godinez, your ambassador with K80Y TV, with a segment of Good Morning Port Hueneme. And we have a special treat here because it's just not two, but three. Who's joining us in this interview is my mentor, George Miller of citizenjournal.us. And we also have Gordon Bohn from the Port Hueneme Center Bay. And we have a good discussion going here. So I'd like to just pass this on to George and say, George, can you start the opening question?
I will do that. You know, we've been telling you about Good Morning Oxnard now for about a year, and conspicuously absent is someone to handle Port Hueneme, our sister city right next to us, which is almost like part of Oxnard, and Port Hueneme thinks that we're part of Port Hueneme. But Port Hueneme is going through some similar pains that we are in Oxnard. And Gordon and I were chatting before, and totally on the spur of the moment, decided to do this show because Gordon has something to tell us about the budget in Port Hueneme and what he thinks some of the possible fixes are.
Well, as you know, George and Peter, all cities are having trouble. Revenues have been pretty flat over the last several years, and that's not going to improve. Being able to increase taxes are problematic. You saw what happened to Measure M last year. And we really have to start looking not at the fringes, but at some of the structural deficits within the cities. In the case of many cities, salaries are too high, benefits are very, very generous, and it can't be sustained. In the case of Port Hueneme, they're facing over $1 million budget deficit going into their next fiscal year starting in July. That's going to probably escalate a little more each year if nothing is done. And in about 2021, they will run out of their reserves. That's pretty serious.
It is.
Can this be fixed? Of course. And it can't be fixed by working on the edges or the fringes. You can't take a little program like the Boys and Girls Club or the crossing guards and try to fix it with that. You have to go in and really look for some larger numbers. To her credit, the city manager, Cynthia Haas, has laid out some ways to fix this. They've identified at least almost $550,000 in fixes for this coming year. They have that amount of money to find. And where do you start looking? In my view, you start looking at some of the basic things on the benefit side. Most people are not aware that the city of Port Hueneme pays the pension, the employees' portion of the pension, for many of the employees that have been there since before 2009. In addition, they pay the portion of Social Security and Medicare taxes.
I've never heard of that before.
Education.
They pay that.
Do they have any job openings there? Do they have any job openings?
Apply online. So let me finish.
And if you take a look at, depending on how you look at the numbers, you can fool with numbers.
Right.
The average salary there is about $80,000 to $90,000 a year for the full-time employees. If you start adding overtime and some of the other police costs I was talking about, we have many people having a total income of over $120,000. So you have to start looking into that. What can you do? One has to do the benefits. The other is to basically do a benchmarking of all the positions. And when you refill them, you fill them at a journeyman level. You don't fill them at the top level. One thing Port Hueneme has tried to do since 2007 is to reduce the exodus of employees going from Port Hueneme to Oxnard, Ventura to Thousand Oaks because they're bigger cities. Well, I'm sorry. That's not a solution. If you work in a smaller city, and I've had experience working in smaller VA hospitals, one of your jobs is to train new employees.
Question for you. Do you think that Port Hueneme should have its own police department?
That's a very thorny issue. If you ask the citizens of Port Hueneme, and particularly in Hueneme Bay where I live, they would say yes, because we get very, very good support. Could it be done another way, such as with the contract with the Sheriff's Department? Of course, academically you could do that. Would the response be the same? I don't know. The contract would have to be written with some provisions in it for measuring the performance. There are some other ways to handle it. One of them was proposed a couple of weeks ago, and that is to take the city's department, look at what the police officers do, the sworn police officers, and see if there aren't functions that police does that can be handled by volunteers or lower level employees, and cut back a little bit. That's another, it's not an all or nothing proposition. I would suggest this, however, before the city engages in that, they should have a town hall meeting involving a lot of citizens to see how would the citizenry react to that, and are the citizens willing to pay a little more in the way of, let's say, a parcel tax, which is an item that's on the agenda.
Well, speaking of revenue, let's talk about revenue. Everyone knows that Measure M went down to defeat, and you and I believe that the city was overreaching on that. Comments?
They were overreaching because there was no evidence that the city has really maximized what they could get out of the existing ordinance. That would have to be done first. And then the other thing, when the measure was proposed, it could have been implemented in stages, not to make the financial hit on the people out of the port being so high. That's an option they could have done. I think going forward, the current council has people on it that are going to be a little more creative in how things like that are done.
Right. Well, another question. We've heard something about 80% of the businesses in Fort Hueneme are not even registered to pay business taxes at all. Is that true? And if so, what's the rate?
I think that was probably true last year in 2014 when that measure was. The city, to its credit, has done some work with the Navy, at least, to get a listing of who all those people are. Now, and they have engaged a consulting firm, back to consulting firms.
Is it true they're paying an outside contract
to get solicit money? I would rather not comment on my thought about that.
Don't let them trap you. Okay.
Well, it's my understanding that the outside contractor will get half of the take. This was brought out by KADY producer Bob Allen.
It's 40%.
40%.
It's an interesting thing.
But it's only on the first collection, it's not.
First year.
Exactly. Yeah.
One of my questions back, it's one thing if somebody gets $100,000 and they're not getting $200,000 back in return. Do you think there's categories of people who are in the category where they deserve the $100,000 and they're bringing in revenues? Because we're changing our culture from an entitlement to a performance type of thing. And I can understand if somebody who was 17 and a half is all of a sudden getting $90,000, but what's this person actually getting? Is there some of that in the equation, you think?
That has not been examined, and I think it's probably not universally through all the city departments.
Okay.
If you look at something like the water department, the refuse and all that, you probably could put in some measures like that to see if in fact they produce revenue. There is another issue, a very tricky issue, and that's an allocation to revenue-producing departments toward paying for the rest of the city services. Right now, 22% of the revenue is done by allocation. If you understand how that is handled, water department, you do that. The city has a contract with HUD for low-income housing, and there are allocations to that. One has to examine the appropriateness of those allocations in terms of what people are in the city management are contributing to those various outside departments. That's another issue. And that leads me to something that I know at least Tom Figg, one of the councilmen, is very interested in, and that is having a 2-year budget. And for right now, going into it, we do some fixes that I talked about earlier possibly, and then look at a longer term to try to get to the bottom of some of these things. The benchmarking of positions, the business of how the allocations are done and so on.
So instead of 1 year, it'd be a 2-year. Okay.
And shouldn't some programs, particularly infrastructure, be even longer than a year?
Possibly. I mean, that's not fixed in stone, but that's at least should be a topic of discussion.
Is it true that Fort Hueneme has a real water supply problem right now?
A what?
A water supply problem?
I think we're not unique in that. I think the idea of water supply difficulties are throughout the region. dipping too far down into the bottom of the barrel, if you will, for the water, and we have to find out the sources. Not too long ago, there was a resalinization plant opened up, and we need more of that.
Yeah. Just to put things in perspective, tell us the population of Port Hueneme, the approximate number of employees, and the budget.
The population is a little over 22,000 people. The total budget, depending on, because there's so many other extra pieces, let's say is about 17 million at this point. And we have about 102 to 105 full-time employees, and then we have quite a few others that are part-time.
Roughly 10% the size of Oxford.
Yeah.
That puts it in pretty good perspective. Well, this has been a very informative
I think so.
capsule, especially done on such short notice, that this gentleman could come up with that off the top of his head. It means, imagine what he could do if he planned it.
Well, to make this all entertaining and to wrap up, I mean, Gordon had no idea he was going to be here in the studio today. He got a flat tire. Again, Bob Allen, our executive producer, saw him, picked him up, helped him, and guess what? Here he is. And this is the way we do things here at KUIT.
That's the price he had to pay for it.
Right? So nothing happens by accident here at KUIT.